Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. Today, I want to address a question that's been circulating in policy circles, media outlets, and living rooms across the Western world. If America steps back from supporting Ukraine, can Europe protect Ukraine alone? But before we dive into that question, let me ask you something more fundamental. And this is where we need to start thinking critically. Whose interests are really being served by this conflict? Because that question will tell us everything we need to know about what comes next. Let's begin with some uncomfortable truths. The question itself, can Europe protect Ukraine alone, presupposes that protecting Ukraine has been the primary objective all along. I want to challenge that assumption. What we've witnessed over the past years is not simply a humanitarian mission or a defense of democracy. What we've witnessed is the continuation of a geopolitical chess game that has its roots in NATO expansion, in competition over resources, and in the military. Industrial complexes' insatiable appetite for profit. Here's a hook for you. Did you know that U.S. defense contractors have seen their stock prices soar since this conflict began? Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, these corporations are making record profits, while ordinary Ukrainians and Russians suffer. So when we ask whether Europe can protect Ukraine without America, we must first ask, protect Ukraine or protect the flow of weapons, contracts, and strategic dominance in Eastern Europe? Now, let's talk about Europe's capacity. The European Union collectively has a GDP comparable to that of the United States. European nations have advanced military technology, significant financial resources, and a population larger than America's. On paper, Europe absolutely has the economic and military capacity to support Ukraine, but here's where it gets interesting, and where we need to understand the class dynamics at play. European capitalist elites, just like their American counterparts, have to balance competing interests. They need to maintain profitability for their corporations, manage domestic political pressures from working people who are struggling with inflation and declining living standards, and navigate their own complex relationship with Russian energy supplies. Let me give you another hook. Germany, Europe's economic powerhouse, was importing nearly 55% of its natural gas from Russia before this conflict escalated. Now they've had to restructure their entire energy economy practically overnight, leading to skyrocketing energy costs for German workers and businesses. France has its own nuclear energy, but it also has deep economic ties to former colonies and global markets that depend on stability. The United Kingdom, no longer in the EU, is facing its own economic crisis with inflation and public sector strikes. So, when we ask if Europe can go it alone, we're really asking, are European capitalist classes willing to bear the economic costs of a prolonged conflict without American financial and military backing? And will European working people continue to accept declining living standards, higher energy bills, inflation, reduced social services, to fund a military campaign that benefits primarily the geopolitical ambitions of their own elites and American strategic interests? Here's what the mainstream media won't tell you. European support for Ukraine has never been unanimous or unconditional. Hungary has consistently opposed certain sanctions. Italy has expressed concerns about economic costs. Even in countries with strong official support, public opinion is divided, especially as people face economic hardship at home. The contradiction is glaring. European governments are asking their populations to sacrifice while the profits flow upward to weapons manufacturers and energy corporations that have actually benefited from the crisis. Now, let's apply some class analysis here, because this is where the picture becomes crystal clear. In every country involved, whether it's the United States, European nations, Russia, or Ukraine itself, There's a fundamental division between those who profit from war and those who pay its costs. The working people of Ukraine are dying, fleeing, losing their homes. The working people of Russia are being sent to die in a conflict many of them never wanted. The working people of Europe are paying higher prices for energy and food. And the working people of America are watching billions of their tax dollars flow to weapons manufacturers instead of healthcare, education, or infrastructure. Meanwhile, at the top, we see something very different. Defense contractors post record earnings. Energy companies exploit shortages to raise prices. Political leaders use the crisis to justify increased military budgets and expanded NATO presence. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is just how capitalism works. War is profitable for those who don't have to fight it. So when we debate whether Europe can step up, without America, we're missing the real question. Why should ordinary Europeans or Americans be funding this conflict at all, when it primarily serves elite interests? Why are we not hearing serious diplomatic efforts for negotiation and peace? Because peace is not profitable, and because admitting that this conflict could have been prevented through diplomacy would expose the failures and provocations of Western policy over the past 3 decades. Let me give you some historical context that mainstream discourse conveniently ignores. After the fall of the Soviet Union, American officials promised Russian leaders that NATO would not expand eastward. That promise was broken repeatedly. Country after country joined NATO, bringing military infrastructure closer and closer to Russian borders. Now, I'm not justifying Russia's actions. War is always a tragedy and ordinary people always suffer most. But we cannot understand this conflict without understanding how Western policies created the conditions for it. Europe was complicit in this expansion. European nations joined NATO, hosted American military bases, and participated in the encirclement of Russia. So now, when America might step back, European nations are facing the consequences of policies they supported. The question isn't whether Europe can protect Ukraine alone. The question is whether European leaders will finally pursue an independent foreign policy that prioritizes peace and their own population's interests over continued subordination to American strategic goals. Here's what I believe needs to happen, and this is where we get to the heart of the matter. Instead of asking whether Europe can militarily sustain Ukraine without America, we should be asking why diplomatic solutions have been so thoroughly sidelined. Why are we not seeing massive international peace conferences? Why are negotiations treated as appeasement rather than the only rational path forward? The answer brings us back to class interests. A negotiated peace would mean admitting that military solutions don't work, that NATO expansion was provocative, and that ordinary people's lives matter more than geopolitical dominance. It would mean challenging the profit motives of the military industrial complex. It would mean European nations developing independent foreign policies rather than following American leadership. And that threatens too many powerful interests. Europe absolutely has the capacity to chart a different course, not through escalating military support, but through aggressive diplomacy, through economic incentives for peace, through rebuilding channels of communication rather than severing them. But this requires courage from European leaders to stand up to both their own military, industrial interests and American pressure. So, to answer the question I started with, can Europe protect Ukraine alone if America steps back? The answer is complex. Militarily and economically, yes, Europe has the resources. But politically and structurally, European nations remain deeply integrated into a U.S.-led system that prioritizes military solutions and elite interests over peace and popular welfare. The real question we should all be asking is not whether Europe can replace American military support, but whether European people will demand that their leaders pursue peace instead of war, diplomacy instead of escalation, and policies that serve working people instead of weapons manufacturers. The tragedy of Ukraine, and the tragedy facing all of us, is that these alternatives exist, but the powerful interests benefiting from conflict will do everything possible to prevent them from being seriously considered. We need to build movements that demand peace, that question military spending, that connect the struggles of working people across borders rather than accepting nationalist narratives that divide us. Because ultimately, whether it's American workers or European workers or Ukrainian workers or Russian workers, we all have more in common with each other than we do with the elites sending us to fight their wars and pay for their profits. Thank you, and remember, when they tell you there's no alternative, when they tell you war is necessary, ask yourself, necessary for whom? Who profits and who pays? Those questions will lead you to the truth.